Is World War III inevitable?
That's the big one, isn't it? The question everyone's asking.
It feels like one of those things, a low probability event,
Right?
but with absolutely catastrophic consequences if it does happen.
It is the question, I think, of our time.
Yeah.
And to even start to answer it, I think we need to look at both sides.
Okay.
The things pushing us towards conflict
You're right.
and the things that are holding us back.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening, I want to be super clear up front. This isn't about fear-mongering.
Right.
It's about being informed. It's about awareness. Because frankly, if World War III is not inevitable, then understanding the pathways to conflict is the first step towards figuring out how to avoid it.
Well said. So I guess step one is setting the stage, right? The global landscape right now is
Tense, to say the least.
to say the very least. We've got these major power rivalries simmering, flashpoints erupting all over, and frankly, a whole lot of uncertainty about where things are going.
Okay, so paint us a picture. Who are the major players on this global chessboard? And where are those pressure points building?
Well, the usual suspects, right?
Yeah.
China, the U.S., Russia, each with their own ambitions and anxieties, and, a fair bit of historical baggage.
Right. Okay, so the players are set. Where are the friction points? Where's the heat?
Oh, well, the Taiwan Strait is probably the most volatile right now. China, of course, sees Taiwan as a breakaway province.
Right.
That must be reunited by force if necessary. The U.S., on the other hand, has pledged to support Taiwan's defense. So you've got this incredible standoff there.
Right.
Then you've got the South China Sea, where China is really flexing its muscles, asserting territorial claims that have put them at odds with pretty much all their neighbors.
And of course the U.S.
And the U.S., of course. And we can't forget about Eastern Europe, where the war in Ukraine has just shattered any illusion of stability we had.
Yeah.
And really raised the specter of a wider conflict between Russia and NATO.
It feels like the board is set for disaster, almost.
It's definitely a very dangerous situation.
But if we're talking about World War III, it's not just about one isolated conflict, right?
Right.
It's about how these different flashpoints could connect and escalate.
Exactly. It's like almost a chain reaction.
Right.
One event sets off a cascade, pulling in all these other actors.
Okay.
Suddenly, this thing expands in ways that nobody predicted.
So give me an example.
Yeah.
How could that play out? Like, how could something in, say, Ukraine impact something seemingly unrelated in Taiwan?
Okay. So let's say China makes a move on Taiwan. The U.S. gets involved, as we discussed. But then Russia sees an opportunity. Maybe they decide this is the time to step up their aggression in Eastern Europe, put even more pressure on NATO. Suddenly, you've got two major conflicts happening simultaneously, with the potential to just completely spiral out of control.
So it's like a geopolitical domino effect. One piece falls, and the whole structure is at risk.
Yeah, it really is. And the really scary thing is this isn't just some theory. Some analysts put the risk of a major power conflict, one that could escalate to World War III levels, at 10–20% in the next decade.
10 to 20%.
Now, I know that might not sound like a lot, but
No, it's not negligible.
it's not negligible at all.
Definitely food for thought. So let's say the unthinkable happens, right? Let's zero in on that Taiwan scenario that you mentioned.
Okay.
How might that actually play out? What would those first steps look like? Step by terrifying step.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say we're not talking about some sudden, Pearl Harbor style attack.
Right.
It's much more likely to be this slow burn, a gradual ratcheting up of pressure.
Okay.
China might start with what we call gray zone operations.
Okay.
Things like cyber attacks on Taiwan's infrastructure, economic coercion, trying to disrupt their trade, increasingly aggressive military exercises near their shores, that kind of thing.
I've heard that term gray zone.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure everyone knows exactly what that means. Could you break it down for us?
Sure. Basically, think of it as warfare that falls below the threshold of traditional armed conflict.
Okay.
It's designed to weaken your adversary, but without actually triggering an all-out war.
Right.
So, in the case of Taiwan, China might use cyber attacks to disrupt their power grid, or spread disinformation to sow chaos and confusion, conduct large-scale military exercises that simulate an invasion, but all without actually firing a shot. The goal is basically to erode Taiwan's will to resist, make them more susceptible to Chinese demands.
So psychological warfare almost. a way to wear down the opponent before the real fighting even begins.
Exactly. But here's the problem with gray zone tactics.
Yeah.
They're inherently ambiguous.
Right.
It's not always clear when they cross the line into actual acts of war.
Right.
And that ambiguity can make it very difficult to respond effectively. What starts as a cyber attack could quickly escalate into something far more dangerous.
So we've got this simmering tension, this gray zone pressure cooker.
Yeah.
At what point does it actually boil over into a real military conflict?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It could be an accident, a miscalculation, or, a deliberate provocation.
Right.
So imagine a scenario where a Chinese fighter jet intercepts a Taiwanese patrol plane a little too aggressively, or there's a collision during naval maneuvers.
Right.
Suddenly you have casualties, public outrage on both sides, and the situation spirals out of control. Or maybe China decides to test the U.S.'s resolve by launching a limited missile strike, targeting Taiwan's military installations.
I see.
They might calculate that the U.S. wouldn't risk a full-blown war over what they claim is an internal matter. But of course, miscalculations happen all the time in these kinds of situations.
Right.
Things could escalate much faster than anyone intended.
Yeah, the fog of war and all that. It's a terrifying thought that something relatively small could spark such a global conflict.
It is, and that's why it's so important to understand these potential flashpoints and escalation pathways.
Right.
The more we can anticipate these dangers, the better chance we have of preventing them.
Okay, so we've got this initial spark, this incident that triggers a military response. What happens next? How does this hypothetical conflict actually unfold?
Okay, well, in this scenario, China's most likely next move would be to attempt a naval blockade of Taiwan.
Okay.
They would try to cut them off from the outside world, preventing them from receiving supplies, reinforcements, any kind of support. They'd argue, of course, that this is an internal matter, a domestic issue, trying to keep other countries out of it.
But the U.S. and its allies wouldn't just stand by and watch, right?
Right, of course not. This is where those alliances come into play. The U.S., likely with the support of Japan, Australia, and other partners in the region, would almost certainly respond by imposing very severe economic sanctions on China. And they would also probably deploy naval and air forces to the region.
So you'd have this massive standoff.
Exactly. This incredibly tense powder keg situation with the potential to explode at any moment.
What could tip us over the edge at that point? What would push us from a tense standoff to an actual war?
Well, any number of things.
Right.
It could be further skirmishes in the Taiwan Strait. Maybe a Chinese submarine sinks a U.S. destroyer, or vice versa. Or maybe China decides to escalate further, launches more extensive missile strikes,
Right.
targeting, Taiwan's critical infrastructure or even U.S. bases in the region.
This is starting to feel like a terrifying choose-your-own-adventure, with each choice taking us closer to global catastrophe.
Yeah, it's a pretty grim picture. And it's important to remember this isn't just some hypothetical war game we're talking about. The ripple effects of this conflict would be felt far beyond the battlefield.
And that's what I wanted to ask about next. What would those cascading consequences look like? What happens to the rest of the world while all this is unfolding?
Well, for starters, Taiwan is the world's leading supplier of semiconductors. Those tiny chips that power everything, our smartphones, our cars, our computers?
Basically our entire lives at this point.
Exactly. So a war in the Taiwan Strait would instantly disrupt that supply chain.
Right.
We're talking about a global tech crash.
Wow.
Factories grinding to a halt, consumer electronics becoming scarce, and just cascading impacts on pretty much every industry you can imagine. And that's just the beginning.
Okay, so that's the tech nightmare. What about on a more everyday level? How would this impact regular people like you and me?
Well, I think you'd have to brace yourself for a global economic shock unlike anything we've ever seen. We're talking stock markets plummeting, energy prices skyrocketing, food shortages, maybe even runs on banks. Think back to the 2008 financial crisis, but on a scale that's hard to even fathom.
Wow.
And then there's the human cost, of course.
Yeah.
Millions displaced by the fighting, humanitarian crises unfolding, not to mention the psychological toll of living under the constant threat of escalation and the fear that things could spiral out of control. It would touch every aspect of our lives.
That's a deeply unsettling picture you're painting. And it sounds like even if the actual fighting is contained to a specific region, the economic and social consequences would be global.
Absolutely. It would be a global crisis, no doubt about it. And that's why it's so crucial to understand the stakes, to grasp the potential consequences, and to start thinking seriously about what can be done to prevent this nightmare from becoming reality.
Okay, so let's step back for a moment and talk about potential outcomes. If this conflict does erupt, where could it all lead? What are the possible endgame scenarios we're looking at here?
Well, as with any war, predicting the endgame is incredibly difficult. There are just so many variables, so many potential twists and turns.
Of course.
But for the sake of this discussion, I think we can look at three broad scenarios,
Okay.
each with its own probability. The first, and hopefully the most likely, is what we might call a limited war.
Okay.
The fighting is largely contained to the Western Pacific. Heavy casualties on both sides, but ultimately, after maybe 8-12 months of fighting, some kind of negotiated settlement is reached. Taiwan's status might be permanently altered, but the conflict doesn't spill over into other regions.
So best case scenario, but still with a very heavy price to pay.
Exactly. And even in this best case scenario, the world would be a very different place. We'd likely enter a new Cold War, with the world divided into these two heavily armed camps staring each other down across a heavily militarized line. Global trade and cooperation would suffer, and the threat of renewed conflict would always loom.
Okay, so not a happy ending by any stretch. What about scenario number 2? What happens if things escalate beyond that initial flashpoint?
Right. Well, this is what we call an extended war scenario.
Yeah.
Think multi-theater conflict, lasting maybe 2-3 years. The fighting spreads beyond the Taiwan Strait, potentially with North Korea making a move on the Korean Peninsula, Iran stirring up trouble in the Middle East, or even Russia putting more pressure on NATO's eastern flank. It becomes a truly global conflict, with alliances shifting, old scores being settled, and the potential for just unimaginable devastation.
So a truly global conflict with unimaginable consequences. What would the world even look like at the end of that?
We're talking about millions of casualties, both military and civilian. The global economy would likely collapse into a depression deeper than anything we've ever seen. And at the end of it all, you'd have a completely reshaped world order with new power dynamics and alliances. And who knows what kind of ideology is driving them.
And then, of course, there's scenario 3, the one we don't even want to imagine.
Yeah.
The truly catastrophic scenario.
Right. The one that truly keeps us up at night. This is the one where things spiral completely out of control. Miscalculation upon miscalculation. Until someone crosses that ultimate red line. We're talking about the use of strategic nuclear weapons. The unthinkable unleashed.
I mean, it's almost impossible to grasp the devastation that would cause.
It's almost beyond comprehension. We're talking major cities vaporized, radioactive fallout blanketing entire continents, mass casualties on a scale that beggars belief. And beyond the immediate destruction, the long-term environmental impact would be catastrophic. Nuclear winter, global famine, the collapse of civilization as we know it. And this isn't science fiction. It's a very real possibility if things go wrong.
That's a lot to absorb. I think we need a moment to just let that sink in for everyone listening. But before we move on, I want to make sure our listeners understand one crucial point. Just because these scenarios are terrifying, it doesn't mean they're inevitable. There are things that can be done to prevent them.
Absolutely. And that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at the steps that countries, particularly the United States, can take to lower the risk of conflict, to build a more stable and secure world. Because ultimately, this isn't just about understanding the dangers, it's about finding ways to avoid them.
So to our listeners, stay tuned. We'll be back after a short break to discuss what can be done to prevent World War III. Okay, so before the break, we walked through some pretty heavy scenarios, but let's shift gears a little bit and talk about solutions.
Right.
If World War III isn't inevitable, as you say, what can countries, and specifically, I guess, the United States, what can they actually do to prevent it?
Yeah. Well, like most things, there's no magic bullet here. No single action is going to completely eliminate the risk. But there are a number of steps that, if we take them together, could really significantly reduce the chances of things spiraling out of control.
Okay, so let's unpack some of those steps. Where should the U.S. focus its energy?
Well, one of the most important areas is strengthening alliances and partnerships. Think of it like, building a network of guardrails around the world, making it very clear to any potential aggressor that any kind of hostile action will be met with a coordinated response. So reinforcing NATO, deepening ties with allies in the Indo-Pacific, working with like-minded countries to present a united front.
So basically sending a clear message that the U.S. isn't going it alone.
Exactly.
That it's got this network of allies ready to stand together if things go south. But what about direct engagement with potential adversaries,
Mm-hmm.
like China and Russia.
Yeah,
Does diplomacy even have a role to play in this kind of increasingly tense environment?
absolutely. It might seem counterintuitive, but maintaining open lines of communication is more important than ever.
Okay.
So engaging in these high-level dialogues, trying to address concerns, reduce misunderstandings, maybe even find areas of common ground. It's about keeping those channels open even when things are really, really bad.
Okay, so diplomacy is key. But I got to push back a little bit here. Are you saying we should just trust China and Russia to negotiate in good faith? I mean, we've kind of seen how that's played out in the past.
Yeah.
They often seem to say one thing and do another.
Yeah, you're right to be skeptical. Diplomacy is not about naive trust. It's about managing a very, very complex relationship, trying to identify where maybe interests align and where some cooperation might be possible. It's a long game. It's a constant process of probing and testing and trying to build, even if it's just a slightly more stable relationship, even if it's not based on shared values, maybe it's based on some kind of balance of power.
Right. So managing expectations, recognizing that we're not going to suddenly become best friends with China or Russia,
Right.
but that there might be ways to stop the relationship from completely falling apart.
Exactly. And this kind of leads into another really critical area, arms control. It might seem like a relic of the Cold War, but it's still a vital tool for managing risk, particularly when we're talking about nuclear weapons.
Yep.
So the U.S. should be working to revive and expand existing treaties, things like New START, for example,
Right.
which limits the number of deployed nuclear warheads.
Okay, hold on. New START. I know we have some real experts in our audience, but
Yeah.
for those who aren't familiar with all the ins and outs of nuclear treaties,
Right.
could you just give us a quick rundown? What is New START? Why does it matter?
Sure. So New START is a treaty between the U.S. and Russia that was signed back in 2010. And basically, it puts limits on the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads each country can have.
Okay.
It's a pretty complex agreement with verification mechanisms, all sorts of technical details. But the bottom line is it helps prevent a runaway arms race, which of course would significantly increase the risk of accidental or intentional nuclear war.
Okay, so reviving New START is a good starting point, but you're saying we need to go further than that.
Yeah, I think we need to be thinking about new agreements that cover things like hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence, and cyber weapons. All these new technologies that are emerging. The goal is to establish some guardrails, some rules of the road, if you will, to prevent these new technologies from destabilizing the strategic balance and increasing the risk of conflict.
Right, so it's not just about limiting the number of bombs anymore.
Right.
It's about setting boundaries for how all these new technologies are developed and used to prevent them from becoming, I guess, the next generation of doomsday weapons.
Exactly. And this ties into another really critical area, cybersecurity. We've already seen how cyber attacks can be used to disrupt critical infrastructure, sow chaos, even influence elections. In a world that's already on the brink of conflict, a major cyber attack could easily be misconstrued or even used as a pretext for escalation.
Right.
So the U.S. needs to invest heavily in strengthening its own cyber defenses, deterring cyber aggression, and working with allies to establish some kind of international norms of responsible behavior in cyberspace.
It's almost like cyberspace is becoming this whole new battleground, a new front in this global power struggle.
It really is. And, the rules of engagement are still being written.
Right.
So it's crucial to establish those rules now before things get even more dangerous.
Absolutely. Okay, we've covered alliances, diplomacy, arms control, cybersecurity.
Right.
Anything missing from this equation?
No.
What about the economic front? I mean, we talked earlier about how interconnected all of our economies are these days.
Right.
Could that actually be a deterrent to conflict?
It certainly could. Remember, how we discussed the global economic chaos that would result from a war over Taiwan?
Yeah.
Well, that potential economic fallout is something that no country wants to see, not even China.
Right.
So, in a way, economic interdependence can act as a kind of brake,
Okay.
making countries think twice before resorting to conflict.
So you're saying that by making war economically painful, we might actually be able to deter it? Like, countries would think twice because their stock portfolios would take a hit.
It's a little more complicated than that. But yeah, the basic idea is the more intertwined our economies are, the higher the cost of conflict becomes for everyone involved. So, fostering economic cooperation, promoting free and fair trade, building more resilient supply chains, all these things can actually contribute to a more stable and peaceful world.
Wow. That's fascinating. So you're saying capitalism, in a way, could actually be a force for peace?
It's certainly possible. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that economic interdependence is a foolproof guarantee against conflict.
Right.
History is full of examples of countries going to war despite close economic ties.
Of course.
But it can be a very powerful factor,
Right.
a strong incentive for cooperation and restraint.
Okay, so we've got a lot to work with here.
Mhm.
Strengthening alliances, engaging in diplomacy, pursuing arms control, bolstering cybersecurity, fostering economic cooperation. It sounds like a pretty comprehensive approach.
Mm.
But is it enough? I mean, can these actions really prevent World War III?
Well, there are no guarantees, of course. The world is a complex and unpredictable place. But these are the steps that, if we take them seriously and pursue them with determination, I think could significantly reduce the risk of this kind of catastrophic conflict. It's about creating a web of deterrence, a network of safeguards, if you will, to make war less likely and peace more durable.
So it's about recognizing that preventing World War III isn't just about military might.
Right.
It's about this whole range of actions, a multi-pronged strategy that involves diplomacy, economics, technology, international cooperation.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that in this interconnected world, our security is really inextricably linked. What happens in one part of the world can have ripple effects across the globe. And that means that preventing conflict is everybody's business, not just the business of governments and diplomats.
So building a world where peace isn't just this aspiration, it's a shared project, a collective effort that requires all of us to participate. Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this segment. What do you say we take a quick break and then come back for the final part of our deep dive? We'll explore some of the more hopeful trends and technologies that could actually help us build a more peaceful future. We're back for the final part of our deep dive. And after all that heavy stuff we talked about, I think a little dose of optimism might be in order, don't you?
Yeah, it's easy to get kind of bogged down in those worst-case scenarios, but it's important to remember that the future isn't written yet. There are things that can help us steer clear of those catastrophic outcomes we talked about.
So let's talk about those things. What are some of the, trends or technologies out there that give you reason for hope? The things that make you think maybe, just maybe, we can actually build a more peaceful world.
Well, one thing is, despite all the geopolitical tensions we've talked about, there's still a very strong economic incentive for countries to cooperate, especially the big players.
Right.
We're talking about trillions of dollars in trade, interconnected financial markets, these global supply chains. All of that would be absolutely devastated by a major conflict.
So you're saying countries might think twice about going to war because it would hurt their bottom line.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No one wants to see their economy crumble. And that self-interest can be a powerful motivator for peace.
I like it. So beyond economics, what else?
Well, there's also been this growing awareness of the existential threats we all face as a species. Things like climate change, pandemics.
Right.
Those kinds of shared challenges are forcing countries to work together in new ways, sharing information, pooling resources, and expertise.
It's like we're realizing we're all kind of the same boat here, facing the same storm, so to speak.
Exactly. And that kind of collaboration, even if it starts out of necessity, can really build trust and understanding over time. And that can spill over into other areas, security, diplomacy.
So these shared challenges might actually be pushing us towards a more, cooperative, less conflict-prone world. That's a glimmer of hope I wasn't really expecting.
It is. And speaking of cooperation, there's also been some really promising progress in the field of international law and norms. There's this growing consensus that certain actions, like cyber attacks on critical infrastructure or the use of chemical weapons, are just totally unacceptable.
So it's like we're slowly but surely creating a global rule book, a set of guidelines for how nations should behave, even in the midst of all this competition and rivalry.
Exactly. And as these norms become more established, they can really help deter aggression and create a more stable international order. Of course, enforcing those norms, that's a whole other challenge. But the fact that they're being established at all, I think that's a really positive sign.
For sure. It shows there's at least some kind of shared understanding of what's acceptable and what's not. A framework for holding countries accountable,
Right. Now, on the technology front, there are also some really exciting developments that could help us manage conflict and prevent escalation. For example, all the advances in artificial intelligence.
Yeah, AI.
Well, those are being used to improve early warning systems, analyze huge amounts of data to identify potential flashpoints, even help diplomats negotiate more effectively.
I'm curious about that last one. How could AI actually help with diplomacy?
Well, imagine an AI system that could analyze, thousands of diplomatic cables, speeches, news articles, all in real time. And it could identify patterns and trends that might indicate, rising tensions between countries.
Wow.
Or think about an AI that could actually help diplomats craft more nuanced arguments, more persuasive arguments, by analyzing the other side's positions
Right.
and finding those potential areas of compromise.
So it's not just about crunching numbers, it's about understanding the human element too.
Exactly. These are just a few examples of how AI could be used to de-escalate conflict and promote peaceful solutions.
Okay, so AI isn't just a potential threat. It could actually be a tool for peace. That's a really interesting perspective.
It is. And it really all comes down to how we choose to develop and use these technologies.
Right.
On that note, there's also been a growing movement within the tech community itself to make sure that AI is developed ethically and responsibly, with safeguards to prevent it from being used for harmful purposes.
That's good to hear. It seems like we're finally starting to realize that technology isn't neutral. It reflects the values of its creators. And we have a responsibility to shape those technologies in a way that benefits humanity, not destroys it.
Absolutely. And ultimately, that's the key takeaway I want to leave our listeners with today. The future isn't predetermined. We have agency, we have choices, and there are reasons to be hopeful even in the face of all these incredibly complex and challenging global issues. By working together, by harnessing the power of technology for good, and by really embracing this vision of a more peaceful and cooperative world, I think we can create a future where World War III remains a hypothetical scenario, not our lived reality.
Well said. So to everyone listening, remember, the future isn't set in stone. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never give up hope. We have the power to shape the world we want to live in, a world where peace prevails.